Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating paper that pulls back the curtain on a hidden engine of our economy. It's a system where, get this, collective belief about how much something is worth can be turned directly into cold hard cash, and that whole process is reshaping wealth and risk for all of us.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, you have to understand that there are basically two economic games being played at the same time. There's the one most of us are in, and then there's a whole other game running on a completely different set of rules.
So, the paper kicks off with a puzzle that you've probably thought about. You see the headlines about a billionaire's net worth skyrocketing, but then you hear they report very little taxable income. So what gives? How are they funding everything? Well, it turns out there's a whole other way to get cash that most people don't even know about.
And that's where these two circuits come in. Now, circuit one is probably going to look pretty familiar. You work, you get paid, you pay your taxes, and you spend or save what's left. Simple enough. But circuit two, that's a different beast. If you own assets, like stocks, and the world decides those stocks are worth more, you can go to a bank and borrow against that new higher value. And just like that, you've got cash to spend or, more often, to buy even more assets. And here's the kicker. You did all of this without selling a single share and without paying a diamond capital gains tax.
So what is really going on inside that second circuit? How does it actually work? Well, the paper gives it a name, and it's a pretty good one. They call it the perception to money loop. And believe me, it's a mechanism that's changing everything.
Right at the heart of this loop is a concept the authors call the intangible collateral paradox. Okay, what does that mean? In plain English, it's the magic trick of taking something you can't even touch, like the collective belief, the perception that a stock is valuable, and using that belief as collateral to get a bank to create very real, very spendable money. Perception literally becomes purchasing power. It's kind of wild when you think about it.
And this isn't just random. It follows 5 pretty clear steps. First, the market gets excited about an asset, and its perceived value goes up. Second, a bank says, okay, we agree it's worth that much, and they accept it as collateral. Third, boom, the bank creates new money by giving you a loan against it. Fourth, you take that new cash and deploy it, maybe by buying more of that same asset. And fifth, and this is where it gets really interesting, that buying can help push the price up even more, which amplifies its perceived value, letting the whole cycle start all over again, but even bigger this time. All right, you're probably wondering, is this just some clever little trick for a handful of people, or is this a big deal? Well, the paper actually put some numbers on it, and honestly, they are absolutely staggering. The authors figure this whole mechanism has created somewhere between $12 and $15 trillion in new liquidity. No, that's not a typo. To give you some perspective, that's a number in the ballpark of the entire annual GDP of China. The paper calls it shadow money because it's spendable cash that doesn't show up in any of the traditional money supply stats, which means it's flying almost completely under the regulatory radar. Now, one of the main engines for all of this is something called a securities-based line of credit, or an SBLOC. This is the go-to tool for borrowing against your portfolio, and its use has just exploded. We're talking over 500% growth in just over a decade. This isn't some fringe idea. It's a massive and growing part of our financial world. But, as you might guess, a system that lets people create trillions of dollars, basically out of belief, well, it doesn't come without some serious strings attached. And the paper argues that the risks and inequalities it creates don't just affect the players in the game, they affect all of us. The authors use this really powerful metaphor. They call it the inequality ratchet. You know ratchet wrench, right? It only clicks in one direction, tightening and tightening. They say this financial system works the same way for inequality. With every cycle, it clicks the wealth gap a little bit wider, and it's incredibly difficult to turn it back the other way. And this ratchet has 4 key parts that make it work. First, you can't even play the game unless you already own assets, so most people are locked out from the start. Second, there's that massive tax advantage we talked about. Third, the whole thing snowballs. The more your assets are worth, the more you can borrow, which lets you buy more assets, and on and on. And finally, the people who benefit the most from this system gain enough political power to make sure nobody changes the rules.
This whole thing also helps explain a really weird paradox in our economy. Ever wonder why things like the stock market, high-end real estate, and fine art seem to be in a permanent state of hyperinflation, while wages and the price of everyday stuff can feel stuck in the mud? Well, this perception to money loop funnels all that new cash into a very narrow set of things: blowing up asset bubbles, while at the same time, it can suck energy and investment out of the broader, productive economy that most people live in.
And the problems go way beyond just inequality. The paper argues that this makes our whole financial system much, much more fragile. Since it's all built on perception, one big crisis of confidence could make it all come crashing down at once. It makes the good times better, sure, but it makes the bad times way worse. And because it's all so opaque, when the system does break, the losses often get socialized. You know what that means? The public ends up footing the bill for the bailouts. Okay, so that all sounds pretty intense, right? But the good news is the paper doesn't just sound the alarm and walk away. It actually spends a lot of time laying out a detailed, thoughtful roadmap for how we could start to rebalance things, to make the system both fairer and more stable without killing off financial innovation altogether. So here's one of their big ideas. Make the borrowing rules progressive. For example, maybe you could borrow up to 50% against your first $1 million in assets. But as you get into bigger numbers, that percentage goes down. For loans over $100 million, maybe you can only borrow 5%. The idea here is to put some sensible brakes on that runaway feedback loop, especially at the very, very top.
And the authors are realistic. They know you can't just flip a switch on this. They lay out a careful 3-phase plan. Phase 1 is all about preventing the next crisis, with things like a tax on really large asset-backed loans. Then, Phase 2 brings in those deeper structural changes. And finally, Phase 3 aims for a total systemic shift, with things like public wealth registries, to bring all of this out of the shadows.
Now, let's be super clear about something. The point of these proposals isn't to stop people from financing good ideas or to punish success. The goal is actually very specific. It's to restore some balance between the two circuits, the one for labor income and the one for capital, and to dial back some of the systemic risk that this hidden money factory has been pumping into our economy. In the end, the paper leaves us with this really powerful, kind of haunting thought. In an economy where so much value is tied up in intangible things, brands, ideas, software, the power to shape perception isn't just about good marketing anymore. It's about having the power to actually create money itself. And that leaves us with a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? Who should we let have that kind of power?